we're in the Discovery Gallery at Alberta Craft and sitting amongst the works of AJ Loudon's exhibition here, Prairie Star Deck. And AJ's joining us to talk a bit about his exhibition and his work. And so I'd like to welcome you, AJ. Thank you for coming by.
Thanks for having me.
And I guess I'd just like to start by asking you to introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about how long you've been working as an artist in Edmonton and about how you came to be an artist.
Oh, yeah. My name's AJ Louden. I grew up here in Alberta. I grew up down south in Calgary, McKinstis area. My dad came here in the late 60s. So my dad was Jamaican, so I moved to Canada at that time. And my mom is a settler Canadian. She grew up in Saskatchewan. And the places that I live in and have spent time in are important to my work. Right now, with this show especially, I'm thinking a lot about the prairies. And so I grew up in a fairly small community. I spent a lot of time on like kind of an acreage. And so just being connected to plants and the land was like a big part of growing up for me. Yeah, I guess that's a little bit about who I am.
So recently you've shifted the focus of your work to include textile work, such as what we have in the exhibit. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how that came about and also what you like about working with fiber, or what's important to you about working in fiber and craft.
Recently, a lot more time for me is spent on creating fiber art. Before this, I was doing a lot of painting. I still paint a fair bit, especially large-scale murals. So I became an artist really when I was quite young. So I'm the firstborn of three. Both my parents were self-employed, and so there was like a lot of time where I just needed to be occupied or keep myself busy. And so they just always knew they could give me a stack of printer paper and like a box of crayons. And I'm old enough that the printer paper that I used to use came in like basically like a stack, but each sheet of paper was connected via perforations, and then there were like perforated strips along the side. So I have lots of like really strong early memories of like pulling those sheets apart and ripping the strips off the side and getting myself a nice piece of paper I could draw with. And so I've been drawing since I was really young. It's funny, when I was a kid, when I was really young, I used to draw quite small. So I'd have like a little notebook and I'd draw like 37 tiny drawings on each page. And then you'd be able to scroll through and see all these tiny, tiny drawings. So might have messed my eyes up. I have contacts now, so that might have something to do with it. And then later in life, I found graffiti and street art, and both of those art forms or worlds really spoke to me in a way that the art classes that I took in school didn't really connect with me. Mm-hmm. And I think at that point, when I was in school, we were learning a lot about sort of like dead European artists, which was like interesting for sure, but like I didn't really see people who looked like me making work, or people who thought like me making work that I recognized, or people making work about the things that I was interested in, mostly sci-fi and video games and that kind of thing. So when I found graffiti and street art, there were a lot more people making things that I was instantly interested in, or I felt I saw myself in. So that was really exciting. Definitely got in lots of trouble, painting unsanctioned public art and dealing with the consequences of that. But later in life, I figured out how to parlay it into part of my career as an artist full-time. And so I've painted lots of murals around the city and the province, and painted in lots of different countries too. And so all of that travel was really informative for me. And just taught me a lot about image making specifically. I'm also a trained designer, and so I went to school for graphic design primarily, and then I worked for a time in the industry as an industrial designer too, specifically working with signage. And so for me, there's a clear lineage there between my love of letters and reading sci-fi growing up, and then love doing hand lettering as part of graffiti, and then getting into designing signage and doing some sign painting. And so the alphabet for me is like one of my favorite inventions. I think it's such a powerful tool. So I'm really, really excited about language and lettering and the written form especially. Okay. And that is all a roundabout way of saying that I got into textiles because I was painting a lot and I needed a hobby. And I got invited to do this residency at Fern's School of Craft. And so I went and met with Fern At first, it was never something I really would have applied for. It's not something I really thought of. And so I went and met with Fern, and I need to give a special shout out to Michelle Campos Castillo, who was the inaugural artist in residence at Fern School of Craft, and Michelle has suggested me to Fern as a potential next artist in residence.
Nice.
So Fern reached out and we chatted and came to meet with her and see what it was all about. And I said, oh yeah, okay, I think I can take this on. This would be interesting. And I'm so glad that I did, because I fell into such a deep rabbit hole, and it was very quickly not a hobby anymore and became like a really important part of my practice as an artist. One of the things about Fern School of Craft that I think is so special here in the city is that Fern's a really passionate teacher. She's primarily a weaver, but has lots of experience in all of these other textile arts. So she's a very passionate teacher and just has an amazing way of just sort of like transmitting that passion, like a laser beam right into you. And so I've just seen so many people come out of that place almost obsessed with whatever they just learned for the first time, you know, like whether it's needle felting or weaving or anything. So there's something like that she's doing that's really special there. So anyway, she did that to me, and now I'm into tufting.
Awesome. Could you talk a little bit about your approach or vision for this project, and what inspired you or how you came up with the concepts?
So for this project and this iteration of this project called Prairie Star Deck, I've been thinking a lot about Afrofuturism and sci-fi, and just thinking about the ways that artists in some ways offer a bit of a roadmap for the future through the language of culture. So over the past few years, I've started painting this series of murals centered around this mother and daughter figure. And inspiration can be a bit of a tricky thing. Parts of this story feel like they've been beamed down to me. Other parts I feel like I'm just sort of like working out as it comes. And so it's a really like interesting experience just as an artist to sort of try and translate this work into the real world. The way that I've received the inspiration for this work was almost like the impression of a historical event that's occurred, maybe in an alternate timeline or in sort of a future past type thing. And I'm sort of tasked with making artifacts that speak to the grand narrative that occurs in this sort of alternate timeline. And so this show is full of artifacts that talk about events in that timeline. When I think about craft and I think about art, oftentimes it's a tool used to record culture. And sometimes that recording is in the form of a narrative, other times not. This body of work in particular does have a specific narrative. It's been beamed down to me sort of in pieces or in parts, and I feel like I'm in a position where I'm trying to stitch them together, or once I've translated each of these artifacts and they've sort of been manifested in this plane, I'm trying to see where they connect and understand more about this bigger narrative. And so that's sort of where I'm at with the work. Right now the work exists in the form of several murals around the province. It exists in some digital work, exists in some video work, and then exists in these textile pieces, these tapestries. My final project at Fern School of Craft was the sort of genesis of these larger scale tapestries, and so it was a study for the piece Mother. So that's the piece right here. And so I use that as a jumping off point and have changed the image quite a lot and kind of continued to work with it. But that's like really where the textile iteration of this body of work began, was as my final project in this residency at Fern School of Craft.
Okay. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about Afrofuturism and about the science fiction influences in this body of work.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. So Afrofuturism is sort of like a field of study, an aesthetic, a movement. One of the things that's tricky about talking about a movement that is in the present is that it's still shaping and forming itself. So to describe its boundaries through words is most likely not going to be accurate. For me, when I'm thinking about a movement that's currently taking place, I think there's often some sort of flag-bearing artists or flag-bearing works that help delineate the boundaries of a movement culturally. So I think of the work of Octavia Butler, who's an author, Black science fiction author, strong feminist themes in her work. And this is at a time when science fiction, well, I mean, still now, is very male dominated. And it's dominated by male writers, but also what I would say, it's dominated by sort of ideas or frames of reference that are more associated with masculinity in the Western world. And so what I mean by that is like this sort of engineering mindset, the idea that the world is purely materialistic, so this sort of like material reductionism, that everything in the world can be reduced to atoms and photons and neutrons. And so that worldview has sort of been centered within science fiction. And so reading the work of Octavia Butler, she's very much a fan of science fiction, has read lots of it. You can read that she understands the lineage of her work within the work. But she's brilliant because she brings so much new to it. And so for her, yeah, there's so much new. But I mean, I hadn't read much science fiction before Butler that had nuanced understandings of the effect of race on human culture or human relations. And so for her to be able to take that that knowledge that she had, that lived experience that she had, and sort of project those experiences into the future in a way that was sensitive and thoughtful and nuanced was really powerful for me to see Black people in the future, you know, and what does that look like? What does racism feel like in the future? How far in the future is it still a thing? So that was really valuable. Another touch point or sort of flag bearer within the Afrofuturist movement would be the music of Sun Ra. And so the idea of, just listen to it, yeah, just listen to some Sun Ra. So I'd say those would be a couple of touch points that are valuable. If you're looking for something a little bit more recent, one pop culture touch point for Afrofuturism would be the most recent Black Panther Marvel movie. And so that was sort of like a pop culture version of Afrofuturism, and I thought it was quite well done. Ryan Coogler did a great job in keeping a lot of what was true about Afrofuturism and managing to fit it into a film that was like sort of a big blockbuster. So those are a few of the touch points. Another theme that pops up quite often in this body of work is solarpunk. And so solarpunk is, again, it's a movement that's going on right now. I think it's a little maybe easier to draw a boundary on because it feels a little smaller right now, or maybe it just feels a little different. One of the things that I am attracted to about solarpunk is the idea of looking to the future and looking and seeing a utopia. So a lot of the science fiction that we find is dystopic, or it's utopic, but somehow doesn't include me.
Yeah.
So thinking of solarpunk as this utopic version of the future that is also kind of updated a bit, a little more realistic. And some of the things that are tenets of solarpunk are sort of like, one of the things that makes it utopic is getting away from energy scarcity. And so thinking about ways in the future, goals that we can aspire to in the future, would include equitable access to energy. And so some of the functional ways that that happens is through things like microgrids and producing power closer to the places that it's going to be used, so you'll lose less power in transit, things like that. But more importantly to me, there's this deeper philosophical conversation about changing our relationship with the natural world. So thanks to ideas like manifest destiny, in Western Europe and in North America and in many other places in the world, humans have a very extractive relationship with the natural world. So we look to the natural world trying to find out what value we can pull out of it. And with solarpunk and this idea of a utopic future, one of the things that helps define that utopia is a renegotiated relationship with the natural world. And so things are more about a process of exchange as opposed to extraction. There's this sort of like mutual support, and there's this understanding of like these networks of communities that all need to succeed for this bigger picture to work. So when you see some of the motifs like the flowers overlaid onto the circuit board architecture, or in some of the murals you'll actually see microchip lines start to split off into more organic branch-like forms. Just through that visual language, I'm trying to find a way to that utopic solarpunk future where we don't see technology in the natural world as two things in opposition, or even as two things that can exist side by side without interrupting each other, but as two sort of threads in a tapestry, if you will, you know, like really woven together and integrated in a way that they can't be pulled apart without damaging one another. And when you look to a lot of like First Nations ways of understanding the world that have been shared with me, that is centered too, is this idea of like, no, we're not here to extract something. We don't have some kind of God-given right to take more than any other species. We're here as part of this matrix, of this network that is all tightly interlinked, and we all need to honor all of the treaties, not just treaties between people, but the treaties with the plants and the animals and the rest of the world. Yeah. So just thinking about that and finding a visual language to express that in this sort of futurist way is a big part of this body of work too.
Nice. Thanks, AJ. Can you talk a little bit about how the themes in your work relate to craft or working in craft materials and mediums? And for instance, was there something about tufting and fiber that really drew you to work with it?
One of the things that has continued to pull me into working with fiber is the tactile experience. So just purely from a sensory perspective, when I'm using a spray can, it's hard and metal, and when a spray can drops in pressure, so when you let paint out of the can, the temperature drops. So when pressure drops, temperature tends to drop too. So I'm holding a hard, cold, rigid piece of metal, and there's a little plastic button on the top, and that's hard too. Yeah. And so it's not something I thought about a lot before, but once I spent some time at Ferns and really getting to know the materials, there's so much process in tufting that occurs before you actually tuft anything into the cloth. So you've got to go buy the skeins or cakes of yarn, and then I rewind them in the studio to get the tension right so that the tension is even across the surface. So I spend a lot of time like touching nice soft cakes of yarn, and it's just really nice. It's just different, and it feels like a type of care, like a type of self-care that in that way wasn't involved in my painting process. So that's been really interesting. And so craft is such an important part of small town prairie life because you didn't have access to go buy anything and everything that you needed. You just learned to make it yourself. And there was a lot of pride and care taken in making these things. Oftentimes they would be gifts for family members or just domestic labor that became important for the household. So, you know, we have really cold winters on the prairies. So like having a really nice, well-quilted blanket is really valuable just from keeping you alive and keeping you safe. And so to be able to make those objects beautiful or to be able to make them tell a story just really starts to elevate them and to elevate your everyday life because of that. You and I had a conversation recently talking about rituals and this idea of these things that you do every day that become kind of the sort of like the bones of your life. You know, everything else is sort of built around those. And if you can have good bones, you know, if you can have a really special coffee cup to drink out of and what that can mean for you, or if you walk into your house and there's a really nice, really special rug made, you know, that feels different than every other rug you step on, right? And you can really quickly start to attach meaning and value to those things. So part of that's nostalgic. You know, I have a quilt that my mom quilted me when I was super young, still at my house. One of the things she used to let us do was pick out the fabric that she would use for parts of our quilt. Not the whole thing, or it'd be crazy, but like she'd be like, hey, you can pick one, I'll figure the rest out. So this blanket has like these little dinosaur illustrations on a bunch of the squares, right? And so for me, it's just like a link to my past, a physical object, an artifact from my past. And so I can look at this thing, I can touch it, I can hold it, I can wrap myself in it, and I can be transported even just briefly to some of those moments. And you know, my mom used to make clothes for us too, growing up, and that kind of thing. Especially as small business owners, you know, you want to save some money, and yeah, so that was like really helpful and more meaningful than whatever like Walmart jeans she would have bought. So,
what role does craft play in your community or diaspora, if any?
Yeah, so on the prairies, craft is really important. Part of it is about the isolation and the lack of population density. So when you live in a really big city, you can kind of walk down the street and find somebody making what you need. When you're really far apart, you kind of need to go to your neighbors or learn how to make it yourself. So for prairie communities, that's really important. When I look at Black diasporic communities, my dad is from Jamaica, and I think about the role that craft played in Jamaica too. And for my dad, he grew up in a rural setting as well in Jamaica, and so his father was a carpenter. And so he made a lot of furniture for people by hand, that's what he sold, but he made a lot of things for the house by hand. My dad shared with me recently that when my grandpa was making doing some woodworking, he would save all the scraps, all these offcuts, and he would bring them home for all of his sons. And they would play with them and trace them and fit them together. And this is actually why they got good at math really quickly, because they had to measure these shapes and see how they'd fit together. And they had this really tactile experience of playing with a physical object. So not just learning from a book, but the feeling of putting your hands on something and understanding it through the language of touch. That was really powerful and important for him too. So I think about the role of craft in that community as well. Also, as a Black person living in Alberta, I think a lot about reconnection and this idea of, my family didn't come here. My dad moved here on purpose from Jamaica, but before that, our family was moved to Jamaica forcibly, right? And so thinking about this idea of like reconnection and finding long lost roots. And that could be a really tricky thing to do, but I think culture is one way in. And so just finding out more about cultures in the Caribbean and throughout the diaspora in Africa and learning about the craft cultures there. And weaving and textile traditions are really important for many communities there. And so, kente cloths and, daishikis and mudcloth in Mali, bogalafini, and all of these different ways of making, and textile being a form that is important there, like all over the world. But finding the language of pattern within textile is a really idiosyncratic way to recognize a symbol of home, maybe, or a symbol of heritage, or something that I saw myself in and wanted to connect with. So the patterns that emerged through textile became really important to me when thinking about and understanding my roots a little bit.
And that's probably something you thought about a fair bit when you were working on the project with the Oilers for the jerseys, right?
Very much so, yeah. That was really what I wanted to do for that project. So I recently took on a design project for the Oilers. They wanted to create some imagery to help celebrate Black History or Black Futures Month. And they came to me as a consultant and as a designer on that process. And so I decided that I'd seen a lot of sports teams, when they want to come up with a logo, they kind of pick a cool looking animal and then they put the animal in the logo. And I was like, cool, that's cool, I dig it. But for me, I was like, okay, well, if this is an opportunity to talk about Black people and Black culture, it needs to stay centered on the people. So I felt like I would have been doing us a disservice if I made the logo a lion or an elephant or something you'd see on a safari. Because Black culture, the people are what's interesting to me. And so I wanted to find some way to symbolize Black and diasporic culture through the imagery that I created for them. And so I chose textiles because the patterns in textiles can be used in a variety of ways, and the context can say a lot too, but they can become sort of a shorthand for culture in a way that other types of imagery maybe don't as much. I find the same thing with food. I love food so much. It's like one of my favorite sources of inspiration. Sometimes when I eat a particularly good dish or when I try something new, I see a combination of colors. I don't think it's synesthesia, but I really get a strong color-driven response from flavor. So that's one of my favorite ways to come up with color patterns or palettes or just even ideas, feelings, directions. And I think food, in the same way that textile patterns can be really specific to a culture, food feels like that to me too. So, yeah.
That's really cool.
I love it.
Wow. Tell us a bit more about other projects you're working on. I understand that you're the artist in residence for K-Days this year.
Yeah.
And you were telling me a little bit about the wonderful projects that you have in play for that event. And you were also telling us about a playground project you're working on.
Yep.
Can you describe those to us a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. So after this show comes down, I have lots going on for the summer. I'm the artist in residence for K-Days this year, and so K-Days is a big annual fair that happens here in Edmonton. Lots of history, it's been going on for quite a long time. And so what I'm doing as artist in residence, I often work in collaboration with community. I do a lot of mentorship, and I've been fortunate enough to be mentored, like by Fern in that residency program. And so I'm bringing in a lot of other local artists to collaborate with me or collaborate with each other. And what I'm hoping is that somebody can come to K-Days this year and get a snapshot of a tiny corner of the art scene in Edmonton. When people come to Edmonton, my two favorite things to show them are art and food. I think that's something that we do really well here. Maybe a little underrated even. We're humble folk up here, but I think we're doing well. And so for K-Days, I'm doing one project that's a little bit, it's almost like a scavenger hunt. So we're encouraging people to explore the K-Days grounds. They've started doing a lot of new and different things there that they haven't done in years past. And so getting people to see the whole fair with fresh eyes is exciting. And so I've collaborated with some poets and some other visual artists to create little bursts of poetry that will appear around the fair. If you find all 8 of the pieces of poetry, you can get entered to win a prize. And I've done 5 hand-tufted pieces. I designed 5 pieces that are tufted that will be the grand prize for this kind of scavenger hunt. And they're pretty sweet. I'm pretty excited about them, so I can't wait to see who wins. That's gonna be good. And I got to collaborate with some of my favorite local poets too, which is great. And then the other project I'm doing is a mural garden. So I'm kind of curated and selected several mural painters from the city. So there's a big muralism movement going on right now, kind of around the world, but Edmonton's got a fair dose of it too. And so we're creating 2 structures that are covered in murals, 2 large-scale structures covered in murals. And so you'll be able to come and experience those in person. And for 4 out of the 6 murals, they'll be brand new, never seen before pieces. So that's pretty exciting too. So that's coming up next. And then I'm also working on a playground design project. And so I do a lot of workshops with youth and a lot of community engagement stuff. And so I'm designing a playground and an art piece, a sculpture that will fit within that playground. And the sculpture will be playable. So you'll be able to run across it and climb it or whatever. And so that's really exciting to me too, because sometimes I feel like art in galleries can be really stuffy. You know, it looks so cool and you want to touch it, but you're not allowed to because it's too precious. Totally makes sense. You know, like we need to keep these things and preserve them. We can't just let them break all the time. But the idea of making at least some art where it's really playable and really approachable and something that you don't have to worry about breaking is like really fun too. So yeah, that's coming up next, and it's going to be an Afrofuturist or Solarpunk playground, which I'm so excited about. So it'll definitely fit within the context of this body of work.
That sounds fantastic.
Oh, I'm so excited.
And that's in Edmonton?
It is, yeah. It's on the north side of Edmonton, the Baldwin community.
Awesome.
Yeah, so that'll be launched in 2025.
That's exciting.
Yeah, I'm so excited. One of my other next personal projects, I'm working on a sculpture that will sit with this body of work too. And so the next time I exhibit this body of work, I hope to have this sculpture completed for it. It's going to include some woodworking, some textile work, and some image making as well. And then I have a show coming up at the Manitoba Craft Council, which I'm excited about too. So I feel really lucky to be able to share all of this work so early in my career as a textile artist. And so I'm just going to keep trying to share that, share knowledge, share kind of process a lot too, just to try and demystify both textile work, but just arts in general. Because I know if I had somebody that wanted to teach me how to use spray paint when I was in school, maybe I would have veered this direction even sooner, which could have been good.
Yeah.
But yeah, those are a few of the things I'm working on next.
Well, I'll just finish by thanking you for taking time. I know you're so busy with K-Days and everything going on, and it just means so much to us to have your amazing work in the gallery and to have this opportunity to talk to you about it. So thanks again, AJ, for taking part in the show and coming out tonight.
Absolutely. I actually want to finish with one quick little story.
Okay,
if we
cool.
can do that.
Yeah,
Cool. Yeah.
please do.
So this made me super happy. So I have had like lots of friends and family stopping by the show and checking it out, which has been great. Our craft community in general has been incredibly welcoming, which is a little bit different than graffiti, so which is cool. But my dad, so my brother recently got married. A bunch of my uncles from Jamaica and all over came over here. And my dad brought his oldest brother, my Uncle Delroy, up into the gallery, and so they brought some family with them. And they were kind of like walking around, exploring, checking things out. And then Jenna popped out of her office and started chatting with them.
Nice.
And they chatted with her and had some questions. And I went for dinner with them later that night, and they all mentioned how passionate and excited that she was to share about the work.
Nice.
And that was just so meaningful. That just felt like a gift for my family. And she didn't know that that was my family. They just walked in here. It could have been anyone. And yeah, I'm just really grateful. It was like a warm, fuzzy hug from afar. So yeah, that was amazing. It really meant a lot. Because I've had other experiences in galleries too where I didn't have that same feeling of being welcome or feeling cared for in that way, and having my work stewarded with in a serious way. So it just, yeah, it meant a lot for me, and I think I'll carry that forward for my career. So yeah, I'm
that's
grateful.
great to know.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'll be sure to tell Jenna. She'll be
Sweet.
very pleased.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Glad to hear it.
Awesome. Well, thanks again. AJ.
Yeah, thank you all. Yeah, definitely.
Cool.
We'll talk soon.
Yeah.
Definitely.